Ta-da. Yes, I'm back. I'm back in the chair. Now let's tackle a very simple question, but it's a question that a lot of people do not know about. That's why I make these videos anyway. Should you be buying a 32-bit phone in 2022? Let's get started. Alright, so 32-bit. What is 32-bit? You may have heard of the term bit before. I mean, when I was a kid, there was this Nintendo Famicom knockoff that's known as the Terminator Ending Man. It was an 8-bit video game, right? And the graphics were just meh. I mean, those people who played like Terminator Ending Man, obviously you know what I'm talking about. Like Donkey Kong, Super Mario, those type of games, like basically. So when we're done with that, we're like, no, we don't want to play 8-bit games anymore. We want to play 16-bit. Sega Mega Drive 2, also known as the Sega Genesis. That is a 16-bit console, right? It has a 16-bit CPU. You can play 16-bit games like color, graphics, and all that. And then the PlayStation 1, 32-bit. The PlayStation 2, 64-bit. And basically everything on after that. Most smartphones today are 64-bit. But where does the 32-bit part come in, and why should you even care? So first off, the number of bits is usually a property of the CPU. Yes, it could also be a property of the software, especially the operating system software most of the time, but it could also apply to other types of software. So let's get back to the question. How do we even get bits? What do we know what bits are? Well, basically, bits are data. The amount of data that a CPU can process at a certain point in time. That's basically what it means. So if you have a 4-bit CPU, for example, it means that the CPU can only address 4 bits of data. 4 bits. That is 4 individual units of data. Now each individual unit of data is called a bit, which could be represented as a 1 or a 0. So when you accumulate bits together, they give you, like data in, bits, bytes, megabytes, kilobytes, gigabytes, terabytes, right? So it all starts from the bits. So 8 bits, we have 1 bit is a 1 or a 0. 8 bits will give you 1 byte, and then you move on, you get megabyte, kilobytes, megabytes, and so on and so forth. So the amount of data in bits that a CPU can address or can process that's how we get the bits of the CPU. Now the Terminator Ending Man, which I mentioned earlier, which is an 8-bit game, means that it can only address 8 bits, of which 4 bits are an opcode and the other 4 bits are an operand. So the opcode basically is a set of instructions in which is supposed to be used to work on the operand, that is the data itself. So basically, if you have an 8-bit CPU, for example, it can only address about 4 bits of data and then carry the other 4 bits for the instructions on what to do to those data. Multipliers, subtractors for the arithmetic logic unit in the CPU. I do not want to go into all that technical mumbo jumbo at this point, but basically what you're supposed to know is that if you see an 8-bit CPU, it's going to address 4 bits, that's half of it for the instruction, and then the other half of it for the data that is to be worked on. A 16-bit CPU, that means it's going to be 8 bits for the instructions to be worked on, 8 bits of the task to be done. So if you have a 32-bit CPU, that means 16 bits instruction and then 16-bit and so on and so forth. So now that we know what that is, the instruction set basically is the design that enables the CPU to be able to handle the amount of data that it is supposed to be processing. So obviously, if a computer is made with a 16-bit instruction set architecture, that means that the CPU was built in a certain way to handle 16 bits of data. If it's built with a 32-bit instruction set architecture, that means it's built to handle 32 bits, sorry. And you can also say the same thing for 64 bits, right? So now with that out of the way, it is mostly like a hardware thing. So most of the time, like, these instruction sets are built, they are hard coded, like drawn simply by means of machinery. The circuits are arranged into, hard coded into the CPU, embedded inside. So basically, if you have got a 32-bit CPU, for example, it remains 32 bits. That's just what it is. And then if you got a 64-bit CPU, it's 64-bit. Now, what is the difference between these two? Because 32 bits are actually much older, and 64 bits, especially on smartphones, they only came out around 2013, 2014 or so. Yeah, I think the iPhone, it's either the iPhone 5S or the iPhone 6 that was the first to have a 64-bit, like ISA for the SoC now. But so they're basically new. That's my point. 32 bits much older. So why should you even like care? Seriously, why? Because nowadays software requires a lot more CPU bandwidth for bits in order to be able to run, in order for the CPU to be able to run certain stuff. Now, it's not just about the CPU alone. Like, let me digress a bit. It's not just about the CPU alone, like for the amount of bits data that it can handle. It is also important to note that the software, the operating system software that runs on a certain CPU can also determine the amount of bandwidth that it can handle. All right, so let's go back to the Redmi 9, obviously Redmi 9C to be exact. Now, the Redmi 9C has a 64-bit capable SoC, right? Because the CPUs in there, these A53s are all 64-bit capable, but it is a 32-bit phone. Now, why is that? This is because many of those lower end smartphones that, even though they have 64-bit capable CPUs, those CPUs are mostly weak when it comes to handling really heavy tasks. So it makes a lot of sense that instead of just setting up a CPU, an SoC for a task that it cannot actually handle competently, let's just reduce the workload that it can handle to in a way that it can actually do that much better and much effectively. So that's why some companies, in fact many companies on low end, entry level and budget devices, actually you run 32-bit operating systems on 64-bit SoCs, basically bringing them down. So you see something like the Infinix Note 7 with the Helio G70. It's got a 64-bit CPU, but it's a 32-bit device. Redmi 9C, same thing can be said. Redmi 9A, the same thing can be said. You can look at the several other examples, but these are the ones that are that come straight to my mind right now. So now that we know this, let's look at a device. Let's look at a software right now, like eFootball 2022, which is a 64-bit game with no support. Konami did not make a 32-bit variant. They did not. So smartphones that are 32-bit capable only cannot run a 64-bit game, because there's obviously, think of a road, like a 32-lane road, and 64 cars are trying to pass side by side at the same time. It's not going to work. So obviously 32-bit devices are rather handicapped in an era where everything is bubbling up to 64 bits, software, games, everything is now running at 64, even apps as well. So if you have a 32-bit smartphone, you're going to your smartphone is going to be telling you that unable to install. Yeah, and some of you may have noticed that you've gotten something from your friend and you want to install it, and it's telling you unable to pass package, unable to install, whatever error message that you're going to be getting. which, yeah, it's actually kind of like a slap on the face when, like, you want to collect something from a friend, and I see it with people at times when they like want to collect something from you, and I'm like, okay, but it's not going to work on your phone, you just send it to me first, and then they send it and they've got egg on their face, and I really, yes, I feel for them. It's not very good. It's not a very good experience, basically speaking. So should you be getting now, I mean, now that we already know what the whole fuss is about, like, should you be getting a 32-bit device? Depends. If you're like my mom, for example, that all you ever do is social media, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, you watch movies on your phone, and basically that's the most you ever do, or you play Candy Crush or Temple Run or whatever light games that they are playing nowadays, the 32-bit device is perfect for you. Seriously, you mostly find 32-bit devices on the entry level and the budget side of the scale. See my previous videos for those ones, right? But if you're young and you want to like experience everything that a smartphone can do, you want to play games, you want to run emulators, you want to do stuff on your phone, you want to edit like heavy videos, seriously, make sure that you do your research and not just walk into the market and get the first phone that you see. You should not do that to yourself, not at all. Because I see lots of people say, oh, this one, like, I mean, the brand names and stuff. I want to buy an AO3 core. Is that good? Is that as good as... You want to play games on your phone, you're going to buy that? Well, it's that brand and they're very good quality. Now, I'm not getting that one. Now does not have enough quality as this one. And, they'll go and buy, and then they come back and say, Jeff, my phone does not support football. What do I do? Is there no solution? Hey, it is what it is. That's that, chat. See you in the next one. As always, like, subscribe, help me out. Thank you very much, and see you in the next one.